Hi, this is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 68th episode of the Truth Island podcast. Have you ever yelled at someone that didn't deserve it? Lied about something to a friend? Or perhaps took something that didn't quite belong to you? You might have noticed, that is, if you're not a psychopath, that you have been overcome by a strong sense of guilt. You might rationalize to yourself the many reasons as to why you believe how you acted is right, and yet something within you tells you otherwise. But where exactly did these thoughts come from? Are they a product of our evolution, our need to make sacrifices to get along with our tribe in order to ensure our survival? Is our common morality simply our biological imperative to survive? Perhaps our morals have more to do with the television shows that we watched, what books we've read, which for the most part have been heavily influenced by a Judeo-Christian ethic that has pervaded a lot of our media, at least up until the 21st century. Maybe our morals have more to do with our immediate family structure, the wise grandma who corrected us when we were wrong, the hardworking father who never let his family starve or want for anything. But then, how can we explain the difference in siblings? Is it our schools and our communities that are at play? Perhaps morals are no more and no less than the agreed upon norms of the current group that you're fraternizing with. Hence, a choir boy on Sunday and a miscreant on Friday. To help illuminate some of these mysteries, I am joined by Luke. Luke, am I only as good as the person I'm talking to right now, my friend?
It's super likely, I guess. I hope so. But if we constantly hold ourselves as we're only good enough as to comparing to the person that we're talking to, say, in your when you said family members, like again, the wise grandmother or the very, say, the stoic grandfather, then we don't really sort of broaden our perspective on perhaps other individuals that may have differing values, or maybe who place their values in other aspects. Perhaps the stoic grandfather, in like even in the same family dynamic, stoic grandfather and the sort of wise gentle grandmother do have opposing values as well,
Hmm.
where like one of them can disagree with something that the other agrees with. And the child, especially in this case from a familial dynamic, a child can pick and choose the one that favors their situation more. So in that sense, we kind of run the risk of sort of like selective, and since we're talking about morals in this episode, we kind of run the risk of like selective morality, where it's like we're only choosing one that which benefits ourselves in this case.
I think this is a really good point that you're making. And when we think of the family structure, we always think of like some monolith unit of like this family is the pure family, or this family is the good family, or that's the dysfunctional family. But there's also like these casts of adults, like uncles, aunts, like cool like people have to take into consideration that you actually have sometimes two grandpas from your mother's side and your father's side,
Exactly.
and it's a lot more complicated. And I like what you're saying, that when we look at things like the family structure, well, there's a whole bunch of other influences, and by extension, when we use the word media, well, we have some really high quality media, and then we have some trashy media. Like, we can't just use all of these things in the same breath.
Exactly. Yeah, and for sure, well, especially when like again the whole familial dynamic just throws, I guess you could say it's an interesting concept, especially because now you have, there's also the hierarchy that goes into play as well. You have the grandparents who have each of their own values. Then you have the mother and then the father. And then, as you said, there's the cool uncle on one side and maybe the aunt that you're not so fond of on the other side, but she's got some nice things to say. And then you also, if you're like if you've got siblings, if you are the youngest, that changes a whole lot of things, because then you kind of end up, in some families you'll end up getting the short end of the stick a lot with your older siblings. Who knows, they might push you around, and then you may see that as like, well, I don't want my values to be shaped by that, or my morals to be shaped by how they're treating me. And then vice versa, if you happen to be the eldest, like myself, since I'm the eldest of three, where my actions and my morals and values can shape my younger siblings, whether they'll look at me as a quote unquote example of how to be, or they'll look at myself and my actions, my morals and values as something as what not to be.
Mm. So I think that from what you're saying, that there is also a little bit of nature involved in here, right? Like there might be one
Yeah.
sibling, there might be one sibling, and we don't know exactly why it is that she gets along better with great Aunt Sally, whereas your older sibling gets along better with Uncle Ted, right? Like, and there is
Yeah.
some nature into that as to why there is. But I think also your ranking in the sibling hierarchy also maybe matters. Maybe if you're an older sibling, there's more of an onus to be really serious. So you're maybe attracted more to the serious members of the family because you know that there's a great responsibility on your shoulders. Whereas if you're like the fifth brother over here, the expectation isn't as high. So it's cool for you to follow in the footsteps of like, quirky Uncle Ted and then get on some,
Exactly.
so like, I think that's very interesting. And I think that there might be, in regards to nature with like, dominant and recessive genes, why it is exactly that some sub-siblings are more moral or have certain personality proclivities that we're not aware of.
Yeah, and definitely, I think, and it's funny that you mentioned sort of like dominant and recessive genes too, because dominance hierarchy is very much what do you call it, a concept that a lot of individuals and a lot of intellectuals study, especially within nature, where with like animals specifically, and even plant life as well, not just humans and then the animals, but also in plant life there's parasitic plant life that what do you call it, subvert or show their dominance over recessive or submissive plants. And the same with animals, even, and it's not just like carnivores, it's also herbivores or omnivores, where there's packs, there's always that like leader that sort of leads, or there's that one quote unquote alpha male to put it, that sort of runs the shots, or and then in people, at least you say with humans, you find that like in the workspace, the again, very much like the family, sometimes the father figure is the dominant one. He calls the shots. He's the one who's going to be like, this is in our family, like especially in a Judeo-Christian ethic, if growing up was raised in a Christian household. So with the father would put his foot down, say, you know what, these are our values. These are our Christian values. We're going to go to church on these days. We're going to read the Bible on these days, and we're going to follow these values and these moral ethics. Sometimes it can be flipped, where the mother runs the show, and then they'll have a completely different set. It could be, and even if it remains the same religiously, again using Judeo Christianity as an example, almost as a personal example, sometimes the mother will take that in a different way, where they would start to see more, I guess you could say, not say polar opposite than let's say what the father would do, but similar but yet different approach to some things. That makes
Now,
sense.
this is so in each family unit, then there might be one figure that's like holding the reins, right? And it's like you have like all these like different personalities, Uncle Ted and so forth, but it's really grandma that's holding the reins and reining in Uncle Ted and making sure, Uncle Ted can do some wild stuff, but ultimately grandma's going to rein Uncle Ted in and make sure that he's still falling in line and so forth. And it's interesting that like it could be the mother, it could be the father, it could be a grandparent and so forth that's really calling the shots here. But the families tend to at least have boundaries and to have like railroad tracks that kind of are in the vision of the most archetypical or most powerful figurehead in that family. And that's interesting because, as we know, Luke, you may not be aware of this, people die. And that can actually just put the whole character or the whole flavor or the whole morality of a family unit in flux if the one holding the reins happens to pass away or leave the family for whatever reason.
Yeah, and it's interesting in that sense. If the head of the, say, like the moral giver, for lack of better words, passes on, especially if it's like the grandmother or the grandfather, the regardless if it's the older matriarch or the older patriarch, then we either get family individual, another individual in the family that takes on that role. We'll see that role and try to fill in that gap that they left with the same values and the same morals that they said. Because like, this is how grandma did it. This is how grandpa did it. So I'm going to take over for them as since they passed on, they passed that torch to me, and this what I'm going to do with the family. Or we can have the opposite, where there will be a family member who steps in and says, you know what, I didn't like the way they did things. We're going to do things different now. We're going to create a whole new tradition. We're going to change gears here. We're not going to have the same old that they instilled in us. And they can be like, well, that's valuable. Great. I think it's time to move on from that.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think this happens, especially, in America, the drop of the nuclear family, there's a lot more step parents being involved, a lot of, a lot of other forces that are coming into the family. And a child may go through several regime changes over the course before they reach the age of 18 or 21, however you want to classify adulthood. There might be, several regime changes. They might be under like a strong grandma up until the age of 9, and then their mom is kind of running the show for 4 years, and then mom gets remarried, and now there's a stepdad, and now stepdad also has his own values. So that's very interesting that like all of these family units are in high levels of flux and high levels of variation at any given point. And then what makes things even more complicated is once that child is of age and they graduate high school or college, or they can like financially separate from their family and have their own place, they also then have the freedom to say, well, screw this family dynamic. I'm calling the shots now for myself, and I'm creating my own show, and I'm creating my own sense of morals. And then there's a lot of questions about where those morals come from.
Right. Which actually is a great segue into, or at least the text that I kind of prepared for this, was Friedrich Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, where he talks about two separate, and he doesn't really, to briefly say this, he doesn't really argue for either morality, but rather sort of offers again, as the title suggests, a genealogy, a historical view of how morals came to be in a lot of societies. And he distinguishes between there's the master morality, which originated from the nobles, or which equates to good in a sense. So if we're speaking like in a class system of, say, medieval England, like with castles and whatnot, you had the nobles who would live, and then you had the slave morality, which was instilled by the commoner, or to use a word that they had, was the plebeians. That makes sense. And the nature of the master morality was that they instilled their own, by using the will to power, they instilled their own morality and values. They create their own morality and values for themselves, and then instill that against the common folk. Because they are noble, they have that power, create their own values, creating their own morals, and then putting that will over the commoners. That makes sense. So in that sense,
this is really interesting, because like when I think of the Middle Ages, I always think of, oh, it was just the Catholic Church calling the shots here, and they were the ones kind of doling out morals. Now, what you're saying is that the nobles had their own set of moralities, and then the peasants had their set of morals. Could you give a few examples of how they differed? Well, what would be the difference between like the moralities of a noble person and the morals of a commoner?
Yeah, and especially with Nietzsche's case, the morality of a nobleman would be, or a noble person would be, very much like power focused. It's very much like we are in power, and we have the strength to keep ourselves in power, and then whatever keeps them in power basically helps them sort of instill that over these sort of the commoner. It's very much whatever they create, the masters their actions, instead of out of like especially nowadays where we can interpret charity as a good, theirs is more like control and
Hmm.
servitude, and instilling that servitude against the commoners is their version of good. That's the noble or master morality. While slave morality, Nietzsche writes that it's very historically, is when because he's writing again from a historical perspective, historically comes from the Judeo-Christian, and as a cultural Judeo-Christianity, not so much religious but cultural, where the church or the commoners with the church try to undermine the nobles by painting themselves as the good, then projecting this idea of evil or bad against the nobles, saying because we are oppressed, they use their power, their noble morality against us. That must mean they are evil and we are good. Therefore, we must undermine that and become
Hmm.
good.
Now this is so in other words, the peasant is kind of like beholden to a more empathetic, if you would, type of morality, like
Very much so.
things like common decency, whereas nobles are not beholden to that whatsoever. Everything that, like one noble speaking to another, yeah, I got my peasants in line. I can keep them. And this kind of comes back to the Karl Marx line, like, religion is like the opium of the masses, or something to that effect. I'm wondering why it is that the peasants don't even take it a step further and say, geez, these really, 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 really rich people aren't all that nice and aren't all that empathetic. Why don't we just not listen to them anymore? I'm wondering what's stopping them from just even taking it one more little step and saying, these people are on a different wavelength. Let's just completely sever ourselves from them whatsoever.
Yeah, and actually, Nietzsche does go sort of explain that a bit, where he brings up the revolts of the Jewish against like the Romans, or
Hmm.
he also gives the example of the French Revolution as another example of where people who sort of embody the again the common folk, the slave morality, and uses that as a form of, and he uses the English word is resentment, but he specifically writes with the French ressentiment, which is a step further, where it's very vindictive, and it's not just harboring the this feeling of revenge, but it's taking that a step further and acting upon it, because you have it's the desire for revenge taken put into action, and that's ressentiment. And when we have the people with the slave morality put that into action, then again it's all projection against the what do you call those who embody the noble morality. And then again we have, for example, he used the example of the French Revolution and how that took place, where it's like men and women and people with the slave morality took that as an uprising moment, and then projected their slave morality as the good, like we are the good, we are the common.
Right, right.
You can see that like in the musical Les Mis, the movie with Russell Crowe and Hugh Jackman, where they're singing, I guess, that triumphant song in that middle of the alleyway.
We the people say, yeah, right.
Yep, yep,
I can't
that
sing,
exact
but
that exact moment is just like we the people against the hires, the nobles.
Mm. And so there's also this idea that, I mean, I feel like, see, when Nietzsche uses the word like slave ethics, right, it kind of almost gives it like a bad rap in a way. Like, man, you guys
Hmm.
are like slaves in a way, but it actually is like a virtuous ethic, in the sense that like it might preach that, like, man, I have enough food to eat, but my neighbor over there is starving to death. Let me give them some bread. Let me, like, cheer them up a little bit, and so forth. And it isn't on the platter of like I need to control my neighbor, or I need to have mastery over them and so forth. So I think in some ways it might actually be like the higher form of ethic, or the true form of ethic, because it really is teaching people to be good to one another, which I think it's a very simplified way of saying it. I think that's the goal or the purpose of ethics, is to kind of create a level of human decency and compassion amongst the masses.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, and especially in this case, again, when Nietzsche writes in the historical context, he's also pointing out the fact that neither, like it's worth mentioning that the full embodiment of either or on the extremes on either side isn't the correct answer. It's more of, we're constantly in this conflict of the two within ourselves, where there are some days where we feel like we need to take control, and I'm going to instill my value on this specific event, in our life. But then there's other days where we embody these slave moralities. So it's this tension between the two within ourselves is what he kind of gets at, where when we wrestle the two together, and it's just like that is kind of I guess you could say, like the daily life, and especially in the modern sense as well.
Yes, yes. I think you're actually describing some moral qualms that I'm having within myself in certain ways. I think you really, I really feel like like you're really touching upon it, because on one hand, Luke, I want to be a really nice guy. I really, really do. It makes me feel good. It makes me feel good to help other people. But I do realize that if I completely relinquish control, people are going to spit on me and take advantage of me like there's no tomorrow. Like I think if anyone says, brothers and sisters, come feast in my house, your house is going to get trashed and all your jewelry is going to be gone in like 5 seconds flat.
Oh,
And
100%.
so I think that in the modern age, I think all of us are on a day-to-day basis, and on Tuesday we might be super generous and benevolent, and then on Wednesday we have like something bad happens to us, someone burns us and takes advantage of us, and then we got like our master mindset, like I'm taking control of this situation, I'm carefully screening these people moving forward and so forth. And this is actually something I think that each of us want to, and I think I've discussed this with my priest friend Sam, is that there's always, like, when we're alone, or we're like we when we're alone, we always want to ascribe to being like this Christ-like figure, and then when we're surrounded by other people, like reality just like slaps us across
Yep.
the face, and we're like, no, 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 master mentality all the way right now. Like I'm not about to get martyred for what I believe like this.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's a dog eat dog world out there. So it's like I gotta watch out for myself and myself only, and put my foot down in things that what do you call it, that benefit myself and that won't allow others to like hurt me in that sense.
Yes, yeah, and it's funny because I recently, I've been getting into some arguments with some people, and I'm actually going to use this as a moral question to you, Luke. I have reached a stage in my life, Luke, where I only believe in helping people that show some degree of reciprocity or gratitude. And when I say gratitude, I'm not a very exacting or demanding figure, Luke. Just, hey, Aaron, thank you for taking the time. Hey, Aaron, I really appreciate that. Hey, my friend, no worries. Again, I don't need you to show up to my house with lavish gifts or something like that. And the reason I've developed this moral code, Luke, about only helping people who are somewhat appreciative, or there is some level of value and reciprocity in these relationships, is I've been terribly burned in my life. I've helped a lot of people, and they kind of just spat all over me, walked all over me. I was sort of the wonderful, like the like not even a doormat, the bathroom mat, where you like just like kind of like just rub your greasy feet on before hopping in the shower. And it's just like I've gotten to a point where it's like I do consider myself like a fairly decent human being. However, I've developed a moral code where I only want to help people who I can see progress, who I can see that I'm benefiting and so forth. And that just makes me feel good. Yeah, I'm selfish that I want to feel good. Like I helped that person and they're doing great now. They listen to my advice or whatever it is. And I've actually gotten a lot of hate for this because a lot of people are like, a true good person does things without expecting anything in return. And like I'm getting a lot of that hate right now. But I would now based on what Nietzsche just said and the way that you so wonderfully described that, I'm like, no, I'm kind of just shifting between a master and slave mentality in making that decision.
Yeah, it's it's a lot of times when we try to help someone out who doesn't doesn't reciprocate, or they don't, I guess you could say, who are unappreciative, they take advantage of whatever we do or whatever we say. It's it's unfortunate, and a huge help for myself too, since I really enjoy helping people in the sense as well. But a thing is that that's personally, to kind of step away from Nietzsche just for a sec, personally is like, well, if they don't, if they end up being, what do you call it, using myself or as like a doormat, or as you described it, as a bathroom mat even, um, that's sort of like that's sort of a reflection on their character in that sense, not our own. And while, yet again, people will call that whole the whole selective process of, I guess, you assisting an individual selfish, one can argue that there really is no such thing as a completely selfless act. This was a huge topic that got brought up in a theology class of mine back in college, where it's just like, okay, well, then there's selfish acts, but then there really isn't a 100% like altruistic selfless act. There's always a little bit in there that, regardless of how much someone, like, whether it's a pastor or a life coach, or some random person on the internet that's leaving a hate comment, no matter how much they try to convince you that you're selfish or whatever, there's always going to be, like, even with them, like if they give money to a homeless guy, or they go work at the shelter, at a homeless shelter, giving food, there's always a sense of pleasure that you're going to get from that. And it's like, and that pleasure feels good. I'm gonna be honest, it feels great to have that, like you're making a difference, or like you just help this person in like just a little bit in their life regardless. But that doesn't mean it's 100% selfless. You still have that quote unquote selfish feeling where it's just like, well, I feel good as well. It's like, I feel good for the action that I took to help this other individual. So I think, like, this is it's a loaded question, and it's a one that, again, as you said, like, people will get into arguments for hours upon hours. But I feel like they're sort of reducing the whole, like, charity in this sense. They're reducing charity to a binary where it's either selfish or selfless, and it's either 100% this end or 100% this end, when it's actually, again, like the master and slave morality, it fluctuates between the two. It's this conflict between the two of how we feel.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's very fair to say. And I agree. I don't think there is a 100% altruistic act there. I don't care who you say you are, unless you are some kind of godlike deity, you're not committing, acts of kindness, and not getting anything out of return. And that getting
Hmm.
something out of return could just be good Jiminy Cricket like feeling inside of like, I did
Yeah.
the right, I did the right thing there. And I think it's important. Like a part of my podcast is that we have to be real with ourselves. And I'll take it even a step further and say that sometimes, let's just say you're helping somebody and you're not getting any good feelings from it, and that person is taking advantage of you. In some regard, you're actually doing that person a bit of disservice, because you're kind of teaching them a behavior. You're teaching them that, like, oh, doormat over there is always going to be nice to me. Doormat is always going to just open up their door, and they're always going to let me come in. And when I'm done with doormat, I just throw it away, and that's it. And in a way, you're not actually teaching that person to become a better human being. I'm not saying you have to go on a whole tirade and scold them for 3 hours, but you could say, all right, it doesn't seem like my efforts are being appreciated here. I think I'm going to step away from this scene for a while, or, and that could be a couple years, or it could be 5 years. I don't know what the right number is. But I think that that's actually a moral act in itself, to be like, in order for this person to evolve as a better human being, they can't just get into the habit of abusing people. And I've actually had friends that did go more of a delinquent path in their lifetime, like throughout, when they started going on the path of delinquency when they were teenagers and then early into life. I'm not saying that this is the defining variable, but one of the most defining things that I've noticed is that each of them had at least one doormat parent. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm,
Here's my credit card. Go
yeah.
shopping. Oh, you got suspended from school. Why don't you just stay home? I'll make you some hot cocoa and you can play some video games. I've noticed that pattern, that each of these kids that kind of grew up to kind of be a bit more reckless with the way that they interact with the world and with other people, they had this like one kind of martyr, what I call like the martyr parent, that just sacrifice. And the martyr parent thinks that they're actually doing a good thing, and maybe even society is praising them for it. Like, God bless you, martyr parent. Thank God bless you that your kid was arrested and you're still there, doing all of this for them. God bless you. You're such a great parent. But I'm actually of the opinion that martyr parent isn't actually doing a huge service for their child, because they're kind of enabling behavior and not giving them the space to sort of grow.
Yeah, specifically like with the martyr parent model, where it's like there has to be a balance with that. Like, yes, you want to be there for your child, especially when they make mistakes or when they screw up in some degree or another. And yes, as the parent, you want to be like, hey, like, you screwed up, it's all right, I still love you. But then there's all caps, but you you have to take responsibility, or you have to face the consequences of your action. Every action has a resulting consequence, and if that isn't taken account, if that isn't taken into account, or that responsibility isn't taken, then it's just going to continue allowing for that. So there has to be a point where it's just like, hey, you're my child, you screwed up and I still love you, but you have to put the foot down and then go further, say, but this is what you did, and now you got to face the consequences. Like, especially if like you're younger, your younger child, especially as a boy, myself, like, drawing on the walls with like crayon or Sharpie or whatever. And, like, it's a very like childish example, or
Yeah.
childhood example of that. And that can go up to like, say, like a heinous crime like theft or assault or something like that. But it's just like, they have to take what do you call it, the consequence of their actions, whether in later in life, if it's something as serious as theft or assault, or something even graver than that, then it's like, okay, jail time, fine, community service, et cetera, where the parent can still say, hey, I still love you, but acknowledging that, hey, you did that and that wasn't all right. Like,
Yes. Yes.
that wasn't all right, and you have to take responsibility for that.
I think one of the problems, Luke, that I'm noticing about humanity is that we're really, really, really bad at finding the equilibrium. I think this is something that we just cannot do as a species, that we're really grappling with. And the case point example is, let's say you have a son or daughter, right? And they get like a B plus in something, but you know that they studied for that exam, they studied really hard to do well at it. Well, I think that's the time to have more of a slave mentality and be like, "Hey, you tried your best. I saw you were up last night trying. Don't sweat it. Maybe that teacher's a little bit of a jerk and a little bit of a stickler.
Yeah.
Like, that's okay to have the slave mentality in that, I hate that word, slave mentality, like the mentality of compassion, right? Like
Yeah.
the mentality of brotherhood or sisterhood, or just of general compassion and goodwill to fellow human beings. However, if your kid hasn't been to school in 3 weeks, is failing all classes, and just getting in trouble with the law, well, you need to shift into the controlling person. You then have to adapt the noble mindset of like, I am going to be like the nobles right now, and I'm going to take away my kid's cell phone ASAP, cut off all the allowance money, just make their, the video games, the PS4, PS5, or whatever is getting locked in a vault somewhere, and
Yeah.
only I know the passcode to that. And I'm like, that's the moral thing to do. So in the case of the kid getting a B plus, the moral thing to do is to have the slave or the compassion mindset. But when your kid is really going off the rails, then you need to change your moral framework to the noble moral mindset of like, I need to lock my kids' video games away.
Yeah, and it's very much like you have to draw that line. You have to draw that line somewhere. And especially with parenting, I can't imagine, do understand like working with what do you call it? Because I could say parents to an extent, because a lot of a lot of people I interact with over at my day job are parents, who come into who are customers. I understand where they're coming from with their child. Like, they want to look out for what's best for their child, but at the same time, all of us have to understand that, like, that doesn't, we kind of have to embody not just again, as you say, one side of the spectrum. We have to embody both sides, maybe take a little bit. It's no, again, before, as we said before, it's not 100% on one side. It's not 100% on the other side. It could be 75-25 one day. It could be 50-50 another day. It could be 45-55 on another day. There has to be this balance, like, with the child who's skipping school or ditching class, failing all his classes. It's like, okay, like, all of your privileges are going to get taken away until you show signs of improvement, until you set that line, say, like, until you raise your GPA up to a full grade point, because you're failing. If you get it back up to a B plus, so then that B plus is that, for what that B plus was the maximum for one child, the B plus is now the bare minimum, the hurdle to get to for the child who's acting up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the problem with a lot of our moral structures is that we don't evaluate context. We don't, we have these moral presuppositions and moral codes, and we try and apply the same set of morals in every given situation. So if my moral laws say compassion above all else, okay, and let's just say you're talking with somebody, and they tell everybody, hey Luke, my morals say that the highest virtue is compassion. You might be like clapping and be like, whoa, great person over there. But then that person is not really looking at the context of what's going on. Like, what if there's some kind of violent felon in their neighborhood that's doing crazy stuff? And compassion, this person can be instantly rehabilitated in a 3-month training program. It's like that person is not really following a moral lifestyle, and they're kind of, I would argue, following a very lazy moral code, because they're not adapting and shifting their morals to fit the context. They're just saying compassion above all else, or this one thing above all else, and they're not really fine-tuning their morals to fit the particular situations that arise in life.
I would say that, like, that's the danger of embodying a singular, singular virtue. Like, there's these there are all these virtues, again, compassion being one of them. Like, if we're going to view from a biblical standpoint, then you have the 3 charities. They've got hope, love, and faith. Then you also have, like, again, other biblical virtues that are out there, like compassion, helping the marginalized, et cetera, et cetera. But embodying one and ignoring the other is, like, biologically speaking, like, if you've got if you got 2 problems, or like, what's that thing? Like, if I've got a headache, then okay, I'm going to ask someone to punch me in the gut so I can focus on the gut pain instead of the headache that I have, because all my mental space is focused on one thing. I ignore the other, and by ignoring the other, you are doing a disservice to those who need the other virtue. The other morality, where it's just like, well, like, say, if you have compassion, one example, like, if you have compassion for the homeless, you volunteer in the homeless shelter, you donate money to help rehabilitate a lot of these people, but you're very, what do you call it? You're very indifferent, or you're kind of cold to, say, on the circumstance of how they got homeless. Say, there's, because there's varying degrees. Like, there's a homeless person who was evicted, wrongfully evicted, because they were wrongfully fired from their job, therefore they couldn't make rent. There's an individual like that. Then there's also the individual, perhaps another homeless person who was wrong, I guess you could say, who was addicted to some kind of substance abuse, because that stuff is substances can be a very addictive and dangerous thing. And then if we're selective on whichever one deserves our help, then at that point we're not really, it's almost like a dishonest form of that virtue that we're trying to, because we're being very selective with it. We're taking one over the other, if we're going to embody, in this example, compassion, and I hope I'm not, it's just an example, it's not a blanket, it's just a general example, it's not like a blanket statement that this is how it is. But for example's sake, if we're being selective with our compassion in this example, like, how is it that it's like, is that really compassion? Are we really being compassionate in that sense?
I'll give you like a perfect example. And again, like I said, on Truth Island, sometimes we get into some really dark waters, but we have to go there. I did have a friend who did volunteer in a homeless shelter. And again, overwhelmingly, most people were grateful for his presence and so forth. But there was this one guy who basically said, I'm hungry. And my friend said, okay, let me get you a sandwich. And my friend goes and he brings the man a cheese sandwich. And the homeless guy takes the cheese sandwich and throws it back at him and saying, no, I want tuna fish, and just like yells at them. And okay, fine, maybe that guy had mental problems and a host of other issues that cause that kind of behavior. But I think that it's a taboo in our society to say that there is like the deserving Oliver Twist homeless from, I'm going to use this word, the undeserving homeless, or the homeless that aren't really grateful for what little there's out there. Okay, maybe that guy really wanted a tuna fish sandwich, but if my friend in that moment just smiled and said, I do apologize, sir, I will give you a tuna fish sandwich, I'll be back momentarily, my friend is actually doing that homeless guy a huge disservice, because he's teaching that homeless person that you can throw sandwiches at people and that's an adequate way to receive services and to seek help. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that our society does have to make these distinctions between people who are highly, 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 highly deserving of our compassion. Like, these people are down on their luck, and when we help them, they feel good. I feel good. We're growing together. We're climbing that mountain together. We're getting into higher plateaus from people who you're basically, from the people who are basically willing to throw a cheese sandwich in your face and demand more of you. And it's not that that person is completely, incorrigible and just like we can never help them, but maybe they just need like a couple years of being ignored before they develop the skill set to be like, hi, I'm a little hungry. You wouldn't happen to have tuna fish in that refrigerator over there, And I think that we're afraid of a society to do that. We would consider that to be just evil, and that if we're not Christ-like and blanket in our compassion, there's something wrong with us and there's something evil with us, where I'm saying, no, we actually have a moral obligation to make these very fine-tuned distinctions.
Yeah, I can definitely see where I can definitely see where that comes from and how that plays in the fact. And it's hard, especially with such a what do you call it, a large, again, non-binary issue such as homelessness, where there's so many different factors kind of play into the situations. Like, who knows where this what do you call it, individual is coming from, who knows what caused the outburst, in the sense. The thing is, it's just like, a lot of times we can't ever really like know 100%. We'll always just make assumptions or or whatever. But I feel like people have boundaries of what they can and can and can't handle, especially today. There we have, again, with everything going on sociopolitically, we got to maybe set aside the phone for a while just to kind of, just as again, a really an example in that sense. But for this, for I guess you could say this specific example, like I guess you could say it's more or less like taking a step back and maybe, having the resources to be able, and then again, not saying that your friend did, what do you call it? Did he ever go back and give him the tuna sandwich, or was that he just?
I don't think he did.
Okay. Yeah, because then there's moments where you kind of have to take, because then work in retail, the retail's kind of a not, it's not as similar, but you do have moments where someone kind of like spits back into your face because what they wanted was something different. And again, completely, what do you call it? I'm not invalidating the whole what do you call it, mental health epidemic that we're facing, especially within the homeless epidemic. But we have the us humans, all of us, every single one of us have boundaries as to what we can and what we can't handle. Some may be able to see that and say, like, and then have that sense of like teaching moments, like, hey, like, you got to understand that that's not okay, like we gotta work on that, where you can't demand something and expect to get it. Let's try this again. Some people will end up, because their boundary limits them from, be like, you know what, I need to take a step back from the situation because it's affecting myself, affecting my mental health in a negative way. I need to sort of distance myself from this and allow, another person to take over, especially where, again, where we got like, there's varying degrees, there isn't really like 100% answer for these, but again, I think it all kind of boils down to like, we have our limits and different people have their limits, and other people can step in for us and sort of, I guess you could say, do what we can't do, just as we can do what others can't do.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think what you touch upon kind of goes to like Socrates, know thyself. Now, if I was in my friend's position, I would not get that guy a tuna fish sandwich. I just absolutely would not, because I know myself well enough to know that if I got that guy a tuna fish sandwich after he threw the cheese sandwich in my face, I would have never-ending resentment for that
Mm-hmm.
person forever. Like it would. I don't think that resentment could be undone in some way, because I think when when we act the Christ-like role, right? Like let's just say that the Christ-like answer to that situation is like, right away, sir, a tuna fish sandwich coming up. When we act that role and we deliver the tuna fish sandwich, we have, as human beings, as flesh and blood human beings, we develop high levels of resentment that actually, especially if these occurrences happen on multiple instances, it's actually like compound interest. The
Mm-hmm.
resentment builds up like compound interest, and that can destroy our inner health and our inner well-being, and may manifest in ugly other manifestations. We might, after you deliver that tuna fish sandwich, you might find yourself drinking more. You might actually go out to a bar, or you might actually engage in more drinking because you're like, man, the world is really a crappy place. Like the evil seem to prevail or whatever. Whereas I'm like, if you're just honest with yourself in that situation and saying, no, the way that you asked for this was in an unjust manner, you're not being rewarded for unjust behavior, you can actually sleep well at night knowing that you performed a just deed and a just action. And the last thing I'll say on this is that for Tolstoy, the worst thing that you can provide someone is pity. It is the absolute worst thing, because pity implies that that person is incapable of change. It actually is the worst thing to offer, because when you
Mm-hmm.
pity somebody, you're like, you poor creature, you're incapable of change. I must bend over and I must accommodate you in every which way. And that's actually kind of a sin in itself, because you're taking that person and thinking so lowly of them. Like, you must think so highly of yourself and so lowly of this other person that you're not even willing to have faith that they're capable of changing. and that pity kind of becomes like a form of like dehumanization in a sense.
Yeah, it's. I would argue. I would actually go as far as to argue that the Christ-like thing to do in that situation would actually be the teaching moment instead of being, I guess you could say, subservient and giving the tuna sandwich or whatever. You actually, I feel like that the Christ-like thing to do was actually be like, hey, look, that's not okay. We gotta, we got something to work on. Let's to have a sense, a level, because again, varying degrees. It's never a binary thing. A varying degree of a compassion where you have compassion for the individual. It's like, okay, they're coming from a perspective that I may not know too much about, but let's approach this from an angle that instead of giving into whatever their demands are or something like that, let's kind of go with I guess you could say, because then again, as you said, it builds that. If you kind of like give into that, it builds that resentment. But again, I feel like I would argue that the Christ-like thing would be to go back and you can pick up the sandwich or whatever, and then give give them the whole, again, the sort of the option, like, hey, look, that wasn't all right. I understand there has to be a lot going on with you, especially right now. It's like they might have, and because that could have been, that reaction could have been out of their resentment or their ressentiment towards yourself, because you are in a bit, quote unquote, better position societally. But it's almost to like trying to not make this sound like I'm some kind of classist, because it's a very slippery slope. And I don't want my words to be misconstrued here, but I feel, again, like the moral or ethical thing, especially with a Christ-like mind, is to not give in to the subservience, like, okay, let me just get you that, but rather use that experience like, hey, you know what, like, the action wasn't okay. That was not that was unacceptable. Now here's why. This is the reason why that was unacceptable. You asked for something, and then I came out, and then the way you reacted, like, wherever you're coming from, that's not okay. Now let's try to sort of reconcile that, and let's have another time. Let's try to do better, and I wholly agree with like what you said about Tolstoy with like pity, because pity, again, as you said, dehumanizes the other individual. But rather, instead of pity, we take empathy, because empathy can devolve, I feel like, into pity pretty easily. But using empathy from a humanistic perspective, where it's like, hey, like, at the base of it all, regardless of like social class or whatever, we're both, like, you and I'm on the West Coast and you're on the East Coast. We live in completely different counties, but like, we're still human at the base of it.
Yes.
Just as much as I am human with or like your friend with the homeless man, they're both human. And at the heart of it, okay, so I'm from a human to human nature, ethically and morally, let's work this out. And I feel like that's how we can move forward in a more positive direction, rather than building up that resentment that a lot of people do.
Now this is now you've actually got the wheels really spinning very nicely in my head, Luke. And I want to run this by you, okay? I had this kind of talk with my priest friend Sam, and we also discussed that every prophet, including Jesus, has given into some form of mild levels of aggression at one point or another. With Moses, it's breaking the 10 Commandments and just flipping out on the Hebrews, being like, get rid of that golden calf ASAP. And like, think about this. God gave you the 10 Commandments and you break that thing. You actually break that thing that God himself, Jesus, he goes into the temple and he sees that there's money changing going on there and flips the table or gets upset, right? Even Jesus had a point in his life where he's like, enough is enough. Yeah. And now we're even going to go all the way to the top floor of the building and we talk about Hashem. And even Hashem in the story of like Sodom and Gomorrah, he destroys like an entire city. He floods the entire earth and just wipes out everybody except Noah and his animal friends. So if we really think about this, a lot of people, attack the Old Testament and they attack the New Testament and say, well, wait a minute now. Why would a loving God flood an entire earth and just wipe out an entire, like a huge portion of the species? And again, like I said, we're talking about these in a mythological way.
Yeah.
But the idea behind this is that maybe God doesn't want to resent us. Maybe God gets angry and destroys Sodom and Gomorrah and floods the whole earth because he also switches between being compassionate and also being controlling. And he kind of like does these things because he doesn't want to resent us as a species. He doesn't want to look and not be proud and be like, I hate those Homo sapiens down there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why he does that. I remember this Hebrew school teacher once told me that God deals mercy with his right hand because the right hand is the dominant hand for most people, and he deals like justice with the left hand because the left hand is the weaker hand, but he still uses both his hands. He may
Right.
be stronger on the merciful side, that's his right hand, but if he sees that there's no choice and he must use his left hand, so be it, he will do it.
Yeah. It actually, that is laid out in C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape letters, where Screw Tape, the older demon's telling Screw Tape, the younger demon, saying like he gives with his right as he takes with his left.
Yeah.
And in that sense, since we're speaking, I think the issue, since we're speaking of it mythologically, I think a lot of times the issue is that this is also another thing discussed in a theology class of mine, where it's like, okay, where we have a divine being such as God who holds these properties, these perfect properties, the omni properties, omniscience, omnipresent, and also omnipotent, and then various other, quote unquote, very much perfect properties, because as what's his name, Anselm, famously made with the ontological argument that's just like God is the most perfect being that we can think of, and he's even more perfect than that. Like, I think he used the island as an example, where it's just like, think of the most perfect island you can think of, the most perfect, like the best island. Now something even more perfect than that you cannot imagine thinking of. Now that's God. And he got a bunch of crap for it from another priest, and then he responded. It was kind of like it was a whole mess. But that was like the start of such an ontological argument of the existence of God. And I feel like people kind of, if we're speaking from a religious, specifically a Judeo-Christian perspective, in the sense of there's one, and something, again, this was bringing it back to what was discussed in that class of mine. It was just like, there's one end where man has this sort of, we have a gamut of emotions where we fluctuate between anger, sorrow, and then varying degrees of both, malice, and then deep like lament as well. But to an extent, one can argue, like theologically speaking, of course, since we're speaking as far as like biblically from a mythological perspective, you can argue that man showed imperfect emotions while a divine being, and I'm not gonna spend time arguing this because it's going to open a huge can of worms, but the divine being who holds these perfect properties shows the perfected version of these emotions, or these so it's a perfected form of anger, a perfected form of sorrow, while humans, we show an imperfect form of anger, or sorrow, if that makes sense.
No,
I hope.
no, I'm really loving this, actually. I'm really loving it because, and it goes back to Genesis, like we are created in his image, right? So in his image means that God gave us anger, therefore he has anger. He gave us joy, therefore we have joy. So God has all the gamuts of emotions, but his application, right? Like his application of those emotions are completely just and perfect. So when he's angry, that's how you do anger, and that was exactly the right moment for you to be angry. When we're angry, well, dude, you could have waited 24 hours before you did that, or you could have waited, a few days before you decided to fire her or whatever, so
Yeah.
we have all of God's emotions, and we have the full rainbow, the full spectrum of anger, fear, and all of this other stuff, but we haven't perfected when exactly the timing is exactly perfect, and just what is that crystal perfect level of anger. And like, even if we go, and another thing that makes me now, this is really going to complicate things more, is what happens when Moses is arguing with God. Is I think there's a few points in the desert where it's God's like rolls up his sleeves and he's like, I'm done with these people. I'm done with, I'm like, God's like, I'm done with these people. And Moses is like, whoa, 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 hold on there. Hold on, my friend. Let's work this out. So it's kind of interesting that in our mythological text, God can actually be talked to. He can actually be rationed with. You can actually make deals with him, and those work to some degree. And I'm like, my goodness, like it seems like even in our biblical canon, God is not 100% perfect. There is a reliant, like there is like, I mean, like he is perfect in the sense that he may foresee the outcome already, and he may already have that kind of part scripted, but he has like a reliance system with us as human beings in that sense. Like there like our careful reflection of, wait a minute, I should have been angry on Wednesday instead of Tuesday or something like that. That is us kind of like refining our image and getting closer to God in some way. I know that was probably very convoluted, but I'm trying my best.
No, yeah, I totally get it. And another perspective that one can argue is that God is sort of like, especially in a lot of the biblical narratives of the Old Testament, where a lot of it's are like, stories written from a certain perspective. It can be seen as like, okay, well, maybe God is speaking to, say, like, Moses, the character, where he's just saying like, what about sort of almost like God knows like the right answer, since if we're speaking like as God is being,
yes,
God is being perfect in every aspect, but he knows the answer that that is the right answer, and he's kind of waiting he's sitting there waiting for, like, say, Moses to give the answer. It's like, okay, he's like, okay, you're there, you're like the professor in the class who's like hearing my long-winded ramble, and he's like, okay, and like, you're getting there, and it's like, you're quite there, but you're not, you're like, we're close, and then sort of encourages the next steps, like, and then but then that also gets into the problem of like free will, I guess, but that's another can of worms.
No, but this is actually interesting, because it's kind of like, maybe when God was like, yeah, that's it, I'm destroying these Hebrews right now, he was actually testing Moses, like, in a way. He's like he's testing Moses, and he's hoping that Moses does the right thing and argues like, no, sir, like please don't do this. And in a way, I think maybe Moses was also kind of getting fed up with the Hebrews, and also was like, I'm done with these people. But then him having to talk God out of destroying them kind of showed the way for Moses to be like more compassionate towards
and an
them.
adequate leader.
Yes. So,
in that narrative too, because specifically, sorry to interrupt, but specifically, I took a class on Exodus, so that whole Moses, the narrative with Moses and the deliverance out of Egypt is very like, what do you call it? It's one of my favorite narratives, especially in the Old Testament. In that context with the golden calf, the Hebrews elected his brother in the sense, ironically,
right? Yeah. Sorry, guys, I screwed up.
It's like, it's all my fault. But they elected his brother because they were impatient with Moses. They were like, Moses is spending so much time up there, and he's not down here with us. Like, let's just elect Aaron. Like, he's the next best thing.
Yeah.
I guess he's his brother. And then I guess you could say it's almost like, with that interaction of, like, I guess you could say, screen cap transition to Moses and God up on the mountain.
Yeah.
all Star Wars prequels-esque with the whole transition where it's just like you have the test
The
of
two suns in the background.
yeah, exactly. The two suns in the background. You have God sort of, especially with this within this narrative, it's almost as if God is like kind of preparing Moses almost in the sense of like to be that leader, to step up as it's like, look, I know you're always the compassionate one, and that's great, but there are also times where, and this again, this all rolls back to call it to the balance of just like, look, I know you're compassionate, and then these are your people. It's like I love them, you love them, but there are times where you're going to have to put your foot down. There
Yes.
are times where you're going to get frustrated, and that's understandable. And you gotta understand that you're going to put your foot down. And then it's like, just like right now, and then freeze frame cut to the Hebrews making this golden calf, and Aaron's just sitting there like, they made me do it.
No, I think I think that I think religion kind of, at least in the modern age, gets a lot of flack, and like going to the Karl Marx argument of like, oh, religion is just the opium of the people, and maybe leaders corrupted the Bible and they kind of said, no, Mr. Peasant, you need to just starve there. That's what Jesus would do, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
noble who's using the Bible to kind of oppress people and saying, no, you being meek, you just, taking crap from us. That's what Jesus would do. And you're going to get like a first class seat in heaven. That's
Mm-hmm.
manipulation of the Bible. But I think the way that we're talking about the Bible, with like nuance and, having the full gambit of emotions and the full gambit of actions at your disposal, I actually think it breathes like new life into the Bible. Like if we actually view the Bible from the Moses-like perspective of like, here's a time to be compassionate and here's a time to get really angry, it actually opens up the door. It actually opens up the door for us to kind of go back to the Bible. And again, like there might be things on like homosexuality or whatever that we just need to get rid of, or just aren't aren't in line with where we're going as a society. But I think on the by having this more complicated understanding of the Bible, that being a good person is not just being a doormat, and that you can be angry at people and yell at them and put your foot down and be really, really stern and maybe dish out some consequences, and you're still a good person. I think we need to return to that kind of level of understanding, whether we believe the Bible or don't.
Yeah, and actually Nietzsche kind of touches upon the again the noble values as for instance as a priest with the common folk, where the priest is a very specific type of noble, is a religious noble, and he has power much like a sort of a political noble. The priest has a specific power over the common, where he uses his will to power to instill his version of, right, if that's especially when the before the Reformation, you had the Catholic priests basically telling people, look, you want to get to heaven, you got to pay up. Like you got to buy this,
indulgences, yeah, right.
Indulgences, papal bulls, and transubstantiations. Like all that stuff. Like, look, you want to get to heaven, you got to buy all this full package. That's it. Like, it's the only way. And what do you call it? They instill their version of what is good, what is pure, what is holy, against what their perspective of the common folk, the impure, the unholy. It's just like, look, because you're impure and you're unholy, you have to do this to become pure and holy.
Yes. And I think that I think there is a instinctual thing that we get, and perhaps it's our it depends on your perception. Like some people believe that it was our biology that influenced the Bible, and then there's obviously others who think that it's the Bible that influences our biology and so forth. And we don't have to really get into that chicken and egg type situation. But I do think that in many respects, if you are actually reading the book for yourself, and you actually are under a spiritual advisor who's not using the oppressive interpretation of like, be meek, just be meek, and you actually have a spiritual advisor, or you're reading the Bible on your own, and you're using these morals in the nuanced, more balanced way, then I think that can be a driving lever of society. And of course, we might be like, all right, well, look, this 20% of this of these morals that are in this book right now, there's nothing we can do. We can't. We've talked about it for hours and hours. There's just nothing that we can do to salvage that. And that might be the case. It might just be like, okay, 20% of this, like, again, in Judaism, the religion I was brought up in, we've got kosher, we've got all sorts of rules that I don't necessarily see the underlying logic behind. I just
Hmm.
don't. Maybe somebody will come along in my life and explain it to me just so, and then I'll see the light. But right now, there are parts where it's just like, well, Aaron, you just got to believe. You just got to take a leap of faith. And okay, we have that part of the Bible of that kind of morals. Like, does eating some pig make me, or some bacon in the morning, does that make me a bad person? Right? We have these parts of the Bible where it's like, does that bacon make me a bad person? And there might not be any way to redeem that. That might just be blind faith. That might be where science steps in and says, well, the pig was a dirty animal and people probably avoided the pig because they would get sick and they would die. And maybe that was edited and added later by other forces at play and so forth. And we might have to do that, and that's okay. We need to be an intelligent species and understand where certain things are coming from. But I think that in terms of in terms of these books as being a moral bedrock, I think that we could still have them. And again, you have the option to read them as a believer, or you have the option to read it as mythology. But I still think whether you're doing it as an atheist mythology reader or you're doing it as a believer, I think there's a lot of value. And I'm wondering, like, is our society really going to be able to stand up if we just toss the book in the garbage and say science all the way?
Well, I think the danger of that last bit is like, then if we got rid of, again, a lot of new atheism, especially the Four Horsemen, that's very popular back, I think maybe at
2000s.
10, yeah,
Yeah.
2000s to 10, 20 years ago. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and
Yeah.
always forget the last one, but where it's like, we don't need these anymore. We're moving on. Especially Dawkins, who is an evolutionary biologist.
Sure.
And the danger of that, at least from my perspective, is like, well, then would not science become a religious belief? Would not science become, like, say, if we're treating like, say, the Bible, the Quran, the Vedic texts of Hinduism as what do you call it? As a dogma, as a dogmatic doctrine, and then we focus so much on science and then also rational thought, then would not that end up becoming a dogmatic doctrine in and of itself? We start to over reliance. So I would say, like, it is still important to keep these and to hold on to these and say, like, look, there are important aspects in here, especially coming from myself, who is actually a believer, who believes in the what do you call it, the Christian religion. Like, there are aspects of it where you have to read it with the sort of like contextual grain of salt. You mentioned the sort of like there's those verses about homosexuality, the very specific one that a lot of people mention in the Old Testament. It's just like, okay, historical context wise, why was that written? Okay, why, like, what was the reason for them writing this specifically? And then turns out there was what do you call it, turns out there was like a pagan temple nearby their settlement that would conduct not just what do you call it, homosexual, like, orgies, whatever. It wasn't condoning that specifically, but also with children. So, and it was kind of like, hey, you guys need to, like, it was more like, look, like, over there, like, you guys got to focus on, like, repopulating the earth a little bit. And it can be taken into different interpretations, but historical context, what it's not like damning the whole.
So there was like a Jeffrey Epstein Island right next to where they were at, and it was
Yeah,
like that.
basically.
That's where
Yeah.
it's coming from. Like, okay, we're just writing this right now because we're just. It's almost as if, like, the people writing that at that moment were just really emotionally livid. They were just like emotionally, like, livid. Like, oh my God, that stuff going on over there. Let's just put this in our Bible. And you're right. Like, we need to read all of these things with a grain of salt, and then appreciate the historical context for the things that just aren't making sense anymore. And I think that's a smart thing to do.
Yeah, and it's actually, that was by Thomas Aquinas, or Saint Thomas Aquinas, who combined Aristotelian thought with Christianity, or Catholic Christianity, and famously, wrote a lot and is credited with, we have to read the Bible not just as something like, we can't just read it literally, we have to take things allegorically as well. Some things may have been a metaphor, an allegory, and the whole debate whether the creation myth actually happened, or whether certain things actually happen. We have to look at it, be like, okay, metaphorically, what does this say? Or did this actually happen? We may not know. It's dangerous to just embody one aspect 100% and just bulldoze your way through the text and be like, this is how it is.
And this is exactly the problem that human beings have, because it goes back to our cheese and tuna fish scenario here, right, where context really matters. And it actually requires a lot of critical thinking. It requires people to be extremely reflective on what exactly is going on in present day society. It requires them to be like, again, when it comes out to punishment, sometimes you might have like the same behavior, right? The same exact behavior, but the way that you deal that punishment might vary upon those two different individuals. And I've heard this from parents a lot, like, well, that punishment is really going to sting my older one, but this punishment or this way of dealing with the problem is really going to sting my younger one. So we all have these different contexts. We all have these different things. Like, even our own judicial system does not treat the same crime in the same way. So murder, for example, you actually get a much stiffer sentence for premeditated murder. Premeditated murder is the highest form of murder, because that means that you were drawing diagrams of some dude's house in your basement for the past 3 months, thinking about how you're going to get them. Whereas if you walked in on your wife cheating on you or something, and you were like inflamed with emotions, that's really a bad thing, and you're going to get punished for it. But in our own judicial system, we punish the person who commits murder in a premeditated, I thought about this for 3 months and executed this, more so than the guy who just walked on his wife cheating on him or something like that and had a moment of rage. And that's the kind of thinking that we really need in our society today, where we're looking at these religious texts and we're specifically applying it to, like, imagine this morality as like pure mathematics, right? The morality is pure mathematics. We need to be like the engineers of, like, okay, how are we getting this pure mathematics to build that bridge over there?
Yeah, definitely. Where it's just like, we kind of have to, and I wouldn't say cherry pick. That would be the wrong word. But we would have to, look at the good aspects of just like, okay, what can we? And actually, Nietzsche does talk about punishment in the second essay of the Genealogy of Morals, of how, like, historically punishment was rarely used as a form of rehabilitation. It was rarely used as such. It was actually used out of ressentiment, or this desire to, you were wronged in such a way where now you will hurt the other person out of that resentment, and to give yourself that pleasure of, I was wrong, therefore I'm going to instill this. And he uses the example of a parent, like punishing their child, where it's just like, the parent was wronged and was hurt, therefore they're going to punish the child, not to teach them a lesson, but to rather, terrible as it sounds, but to hurt them for revenge, out of resentment. And it also kind of reflects, since you mentioned the judicial system, it also reflects a little bit on that as well. If we're going to bring in, say, like a thinker like Thomas Hobbes and his gargantuan piece of work, the Leviathan, where it's like, we need a government, or like, we need a king to, like, because humans are animalistic, and if you disobey the Leviathan, the government, the king, or the ruler, then you're going to be made an example of. it's not to rehabilitate you back into society. It's more of, you're going to be made an example of what not to do. So that way you're going to be a warning, a display piece for everybody else in this city. And the psychologist Foucault writes that in his book Discipline and Punish, where it's just like, historically a lot of, which is also genealogy, historically a lot of these capital punishment executions were done, again, not to rehabilitate anyone, but rather to show everyone else, this is what happens when you go against this. This is what happens when you threaten the authority of the individual who is in authority, or the what do you call it, the state that's in authority. If you do that, then you're going to end up like them. Don't be like them. And
Yes.
you
And
know,
I think that it comes down to, when we're extracting our morals, what we're trying to seek is the high ground of justice, and not punishment for the sake of just watching someone scream and suffer. And I think
right?
that's actually an evil act in itself. And I think of people like Ivan the Terrible, and who would impale people and boil people and do all, like, things that were just, as the younger generation would say, that's OD, right? Like
Yeah.
they're going way too far, and they're committing evil. Their punishments or whatever are evil. They're just evil because they're not there to bring harmony and justice to the universe. They're just there to, like, take it to a whole other extreme. I actually think that's a great topic for another podcast. Luke, thank you so much for being on the show today.
No, thank you for having me, Aaron. I greatly appreciate this.
Anytime, my friend. This concludes the 68th episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azrod.